It started with a shimmer on the bathroom floor. I just walked in, feeling the usual morning haze, when a glint caught my eye. At first, I thought it was a stray piece of glass, maybe something from the kids' toys. Jessica, my wife of 9 years, hadn't mentioned dropping anything, but with 2 kids under 6, things fell often enough. I stooped down and pinched the little circle between my fingers, a tiny foil backing, like from a pill pack. I turned it over, squinting at the lettering. It was a birth control pill backing. The room went silent. My mind didn't immediately go where it should have. No, it hesitated, giving Jessica the benefit of the doubt like it always did. I'd had a vasectomy 2 years ago, at Jessica's suggestion. She'd always been clear about wanting to focus on her career and that 2 kids were enough. After all, that's what we'd agreed on. So why would she need these? I stood up slowly, brushing the foil against my thumb, the silence in the bathroom suddenly oppressive. I stuffed the piece into my pocket, hands unsteady as I took one last look around. Maybe I was overthinking. Maybe there was a logical explanation. But the rest of that day, my thoughts kept circling back to it, and by evening, they were swirling like storm clouds. We went through our usual routine. She cooked while I set the table, both of us stealing glances at our kids, our little son, Leo, chasing his older sister, Mia, around the kitchen island. They were the kind of moments that, just a day earlier, I would have counted myself lucky for. And yet, with every laugh, every shared glance, that foil backing kept pressing against me like a rock in my shoe. Later, once Jessica was asleep, I found myself creeping back to the bathroom. This time, I searched with a focused intensity, pulling open drawers, sorting through boxes of toiletries. And there it was, tucked neatly beneath a bottle of aspirin and a loose pack of tampons, a strip of pills. My breath stalled as I realized what I was looking at. These were indeed birth control pills, the same kind she used to take back when we first started dating. My mind twisted itself in knots, trying to make sense of it. Why was she back on these pills? The simplest answer slashed through me, sharp and cold. She was seeing someone else. I'd always heard that people talk about betrayal as if it's a clean break, an immediate shattering of trust. But the truth is, betrayal doesn't reveal itself all at once. It creeps in, subtly, giving you just enough doubt to convince you that you're the one overreacting. That night, I sat at the edge of our bed, watching her sleep, the rise and fall of her breath mocking my racing mind. I didn't sleep at all, just stared into the dark, wondering if everything I thought I knew was a lie. The next day, I went through the motions, my mind spinning with questions I couldn't answer. Who could it be? How long had this been going on? I kept my suspicions to myself, letting Jessica's routine unfold as naturally as ever, observing every detail. She seemed the same, affectionate with me, attentive with the kids, but now every action felt loaded, every smile suspect. For the first time in years, I felt like a stranger in my own home. I knew I couldn't live in this half-truth. I needed answers, solid proof of what I only half believed to be true. A quick search online opened my world to the tools I needed: DNA kits, small recording devices, even tiny cameras. I placed the orders, each one filling me with an odd mix of dread and determination. By Friday, everything had arrived. When Jessica took Leo and Mia to the park that afternoon, I finally had the space to set up the cameras around the house. I placed one in our bathroom, another in the living room, and a third in our bedroom, positioning it discreetly for a clear view of the bed. Each motion felt both surreal and grounding, like I was wading into dangerous waters, but couldn't bring myself to turn back. I'd never pictured myself in this position, the type to suspect, to spy. But here I was, choosing not to trust her word over some gut feeling that whispered everything was wrong. As the weekend passed, I replayed the clues over and over, feeling as if I were trapped in some slow-motion nightmare. Jessica carried on as she always had, calm, with the same laugh, the same stories about her day, the same looks she'd always given me. It was maddening, the way she seemed so normal, but I was certain that her smile, her laugh, they hid something beneath, a private life she thought I would never discover. I watched and waited, recording our lives as if I were no longer a part of them but a voyeur, desperate for any scrap of evidence to unravel the truth. I scoured her phone and checked our text history, but there were only the typical messages, mundane, almost hollow reminders about groceries and dinner plans, little endearments that now felt like lies. On Monday, while she was out at work, I reviewed the footage from the cameras. My hands shook as I scrolled through the hours, anxious but strangely hopeful, thinking maybe I'd see nothing. That maybe I was just paranoid. Then, there it was, a moment that sent a cold wave down my spine. While I'd been with the kids in the kitchen, Jessica had disappeared upstairs to the bathroom. The footage showed her standing in front of the mirror, makeup bag open, but her gaze kept darting toward the door. Then, she reached up to the vent above our bathroom mirror, pulling down a small, sleek phone, a model I'd never seen her use. She tapped at the screen, scrolling and typing furiously, a smile flitting across her face as she did. That phone. It was like a neon sign flashing in my mind, a beacon screaming of secrets. I knew then what I had to do. I sat back, heart pounding, staring at the paused footage on my laptop. Jessica's secret phone. Every unanswered question I had was suddenly tied to that sleek device she'd hidden so carefully. My mind swirled with possibilities, none of them good. I kept rewatching the clip, hoping to decipher some expression, some clue about what or who she was hiding. That smile on her face was a stranger's smile, directed at someone who wasn't me. I felt lost, yet a strange resolve settled in. If I wanted the truth, I'd have to be methodical, to investigate her as if I were peeling back layers of a stranger's life. I began researching everything I could think of, sifting through marriage forums, cheating advice columns, even private investigation sites. How to catch a cheating spouse became my daily search, each click taking me deeper into the world of suspicion and surveillance. It was as though I'd shed the skin of a trusting husband, now turning into an unwilling investigator. Then, on Wednesday, the first package arrived, a small GPS tracking device no bigger than a credit card. I hid it in the trunk of Jessica's car, wedged it in where it couldn't slip out or be easily discovered. I told myself it was just for peace of mind, that I'd track her location for a few days and see if she was really where she claimed to be. Yet as soon as I'd installed it, a rush of both relief and anxiety flooded over me, as if I'd crossed a line I could never uncross. As I watched her in the following days, I noticed things I'd never thought to question before. Jessica's recent shopping trip seemed longer, the bags she brought home holding less than they used to. She'd always been the type to save her receipts, organizing everything for our monthly budget talks. But lately, there were fewer receipts, almost like she was covering her tracks. I started logging her spending habits, feeling a fresh wave of suspicion creep in every time she reached for her purse. I'd started wondering about our money, too. For the first time in years, I began combing through our finances with a critical eye. Each day, during my lunch break, I'd log into our online banking to study the statements, trying to remember which purchases had been mine and which had been hers. But there were charges I couldn't place, strange deductions that stood out like sore thumbs. One night, when Jessica was asleep, I scrolled back through the transactions over the past few months. Small things at first, like a few unfamiliar charges at high-end restaurants where I'd never been, or deposits to accounts I hadn't set up. Most were in cash, untraceable. One particular charge at a boutique hotel in the city made my stomach drop. She'd made the payment last month, on the exact day I'd been on an overnight work trip. I remembered calling her that night, and she'd sounded distracted, saying she'd been exhausted from work and went to bed early. Now I wondered if that whole story had been fabricated, a cover for an affair unfolding right under my nose. These discoveries turned each moment with Jessica into an exercise in self-control. I couldn't tip her off, couldn't give her the slightest hint that I was watching. Instead, I'd pretend to be the same man she'd always known, the doting husband, the reliable father, the one who would never suspect a thing. Meanwhile, I was gathering evidence with a cold, methodical determination I barely recognized. After a week, the GPS tracking device started paying off. On 2 occasions, while I was at work, I noticed her car was nowhere near her office. Instead, it was parked on the far side of town in a residential neighborhood. I even checked the street view to see the exact spot, a row of small, older houses, nothing special, just ordinary places you'd pass by without a second thought. But her car was there, parked for hours in front of a house I didn't recognize. I resisted the urge to confront her that night, instead tucking my anger away and focusing on getting more evidence. Each new detail felt like another nail in the coffin of our marriage, yet I still hoped there was some logical explanation, a way this could all be a misunderstanding. Still, deep down, I knew that hope was just the last part of me that hadn't fully accepted the truth. Then came the phone cloning device, a sleek, unassuming gadget that looked like an external hard drive. I read the manual twice over, hands shaking with a strange anticipation. With this device, I could clone her phone, downloading every message, every photo, every app she'd ever used. Once she fell asleep, I slipped into the bathroom, shutting the door behind me and, holding my breath, connected her phone to the device. It took only 5 minutes that felt like an eternity. My pulse was racing as I slid her phone back on the nightstand, returning the device to my office. Now, all I had to do was wait for the download to finish. The next morning, I woke before dawn, the cloned files ready and waiting on my laptop. I clicked through the messages first, eyes scanning down the rows of texts. At first, they seemed normal, full of familiar names and threads I recognized. But then I saw a contact with only initials, DB. There were no identifying details, no pictures, just a stream of texts. They were brief at first, casual greetings, late-night check-ins. But then I read through a conversation from 2 weeks ago, and the familiar world around me seemed to slip away. "I missed you yesterday," the message read. Jessica's reply followed immediately. "Me too. Wish we could have more time." My hands were shaking. I scrolled further, watching as their conversations shifted from flirty banter to intimate confessions. It felt like reading someone else's life, a story that was both foreign and horrifyingly close. And then there were the pictures, selfies she'd taken, angled just right, the kind she'd never send to me. I felt sick, humiliated. Every detail, every smiling face, every candid photo felt like a betrayal, like she was showing this stranger pieces of herself that had once been mine. In the next few days, I went deeper, combing through each text thread and every phone call log, noting every location where she'd met up with DB. The pattern was painfully clear. They met once, sometimes twice a week, often at the same boutique hotel I'd found on our bank statement. I felt hollowed out, drained of every emotion except anger. Yet, beneath that anger, I felt something else, a question I couldn't shake. How had she kept this from me for so long? I thought back to all those times when things didn't quite add up, the subtle changes that I'd brushed off. The nights she claimed to work late, the weekend outings she said were with her sister, the gifts she'd bought for work friends. It all clicked into place now, forming a damning puzzle that made me feel both devastated and stupid. I decided to dig further, researching the DB contact as if I were a private investigator. I typed the initials into search engines, checked them against public records, and soon enough, I found him, a Daniel Barrett, local attorney, recently divorced, no kids. There were pictures on his firm's website, a man with an easy smile and confident posture. My stomach churned. He looked polished, successful. Exactly the type of person Jessica had always admired, the opposite of what I'd thought she wanted in a husband. I realized that this wasn't just a fling. It was a relationship. There were plans, discussions about the future hidden in those messages, hints at a life she'd started to envision with someone else. I felt like I'd been blind for so long, oblivious to the changes she'd been making right in front of me. One night, when she was out with friends, I took things a step further. I'd been researching ways to track finances, and with some digging, I found a way to view her credit card statements without her knowing. I logged into her account, heart pounding as I scrolled through the charges. The transactions confirmed everything. There were dinners for two, hotel stays, even jewelry, gifts she'd never worn in front of me. And worse yet, I saw recent withdrawals of several $1,000s from our joint account. Money she was taking out bit by bit, siphoning away like she was preparing to leave, $1 at a time. The realization hit me hard. She wasn't just cheating on me. She was slowly, methodically removing herself from our life together, preparing an escape route with a man who seemed like he had everything I'd never been. That night, as I lay beside her, my mind churned with questions and anger. But I knew one thing for sure. I wouldn't let her do this to me. Not without understanding every last piece of what she'd been planning. I felt a strange calm settle over me as the reality sank in. Jessica's betrayal had shattered the foundation of our marriage, but with each new discovery, a different side of me started emerging. A version of myself I didn't recognize but had somehow been waiting for all along. As I lay awake beside her that night, my mind turned to thoughts of retribution. But I knew this couldn't be some knee-jerk reaction, a screaming confrontation that would leave me empty-handed and humiliated. No, she had planned her deception down to the smallest detail. She'd manipulated our finances, her time, even our children's lives. I would have to do the same. I couldn't let her know I was onto her. My revenge needed to be methodical, with the same precision she had used to betray me. The next morning, I got up early, long before Jessica or the kids were awake. Sitting at the kitchen table, sipping a cup of coffee that tasted more bitter than usual, I pulled out a notebook and started to map out my strategy. I needed information, leverage, and, ultimately, an escape plan of my own. The first part of my plan was to dig deeper into her connection with Daniel Barrett. I'd been lurking around his social media profiles, gathering scraps of information, but I needed more. His law office had an open house scheduled in a few weeks, an evening event to attract local business owners. Jessica hadn't mentioned it, but I was almost certain she'd attend, if only to support him from the shadows. On the day of the event, I left work early, telling Jessica I had a late meeting. I donned a simple dark suit and drove across town, parking a block away from Daniel's law firm. As I slipped into the event, I found myself blending easily into the crowd of polished professionals, each sipping their wine and making small talk. I scanned the room, half expecting Jessica to be by his side, but instead, I spotted her by the windows, keeping her distance, trying to look inconspicuous. It was clear she didn't want anyone connecting them. As Daniel mingled, shaking hands and exchanging smiles, I moved closer to Jessica, careful to stay out of her line of sight. Then I watched as her expression softened, as though she was the real her, someone only he got to see. It was like watching a stranger's life unfold. I saw Daniel's arm casually brush against her shoulder, a gesture that was too intimate for colleagues. She lit up, her eyes dancing in a way I hadn't seen in years, as if he held the key to a future she'd been quietly building while erasing ours. That night, as Jessica lay sleeping beside me, my plans sharpened. I would not only expose her affair, I'd dismantle her carefully built world piece by piece. The next step was to ensure she couldn't suspect what I was planning. Over the following weeks, I became the husband she probably thought she'd left behind. I surprised her with small gestures, just enough to make her believe that I was oblivious, happy, even clueless. I knew she'd dismiss any unusual behavior on my part as an attempt to win her back. She seemed almost smug, confident that she was manipulating me. Then, one evening, she brought up the idea of a separate savings account. The request was almost laughable, but I played along. She'd suggested it under the pretense of financial planning, of wanting security. I nodded as though the idea had merit, hiding my simmering anger behind a practiced smile. Little did she know, I'd already started emptying our accounts, bit by bit, just enough so she wouldn't notice the subtle financial bleeding until it was far too late. A month later, I came home from work early, using the excuse of a migraine. I wanted to see if my intuition was right. Sure enough, when I pulled into the driveway, her car was gone. She'd taken off in the middle of the afternoon, claiming she had a meeting. I pulled up my phone, tracking her location via the GPS I'd installed in her car. The little dot flashed downtown, leading me to the same boutique hotel where she'd met him before. My heart thudded in my chest, a familiar sick feeling twisting in my stomach, but I swallowed it down. Parking nearby, I waited and watched, blending into the shadows outside the hotel entrance. 2 hours passed, then 3. Finally, I saw them walk out together, laughing as they stepped onto the street. They looked like a couple, one oblivious to the world, one flaunting their connection. I took a quick photo from my car, capturing their stolen moment as evidence for later. The next day, I reached out to an old friend, Garrett, who ran a private investigation firm. We'd known each other in college, and he owed me a favor. I filled him in, leaving out the grittiest details but giving him just enough to understand the betrayal. Garrett listened in silence, then assured me he could get the information I needed to make my next move. Days passed as I waited for Garrett's findings. It was a tense waiting game, every interaction with Jessica a test of my patience. She continued her affair, oblivious to the web I was spinning around her, trusting that she was one step ahead. But she had no idea how much I already knew. One evening, Garrett called me, his voice steady but edged with tension. "You're not going to like this," he warned, "but I found out more than you expected. Daniel Barrett. He's connected to some very questionable people. Jessica might be in deeper than you realize." A chill settled over me as Garrett laid out the details. Daniel wasn't just a well-connected attorney. He had a history of representing people on the fringes of legality, clients who operated under the radar, laundering money through shell corporations. Garrett speculated that Jessica might not even know the full extent of Daniel's dealings, that she'd simply been lured in by his charm and wealth, unaware of the potential danger. But what made it worse was the possibility that she did know, and that she was involved. With Garrett's findings, I decided to take things up a notch. I purchased an anonymous phone and started leaving subtle hints for Jessica, cryptic messages that hinted at the affair, messages meant to get under her skin. I'd send a simple, "I see you," when she was out with Daniel, or a "does he know?" after a night out. The idea was to rattle her just enough to make her paranoid, to plant the seed of doubt. Every time she looked over her shoulder, every time her phone pinged, I wanted her to feel a sliver of the unease I'd been living with. Soon, I could see it working. She became more distant, less composed, occasionally jumping when her phone buzzed. She even mentioned feeling watched, but I shrugged it off, playing the part of the oblivious husband, telling her she was just stressed from work. My subtle messages continued, each one strategically timed and vague enough to keep her guessing. Jessica's paranoia grew, and I could see her unraveling bit by bit. Then, one day, I stumbled upon a shocking twist that even I hadn't seen coming. As I scrolled through a newly cloned set of messages from her secret phone, I saw something that made my stomach drop. Jessica was asking Daniel about transferring a large sum of money, our money, into an offshore account. She'd saved up from our joint accounts and was now plotting to funnel it away, using him as a guide. The text chain was explicit, detailing the transfers and the various accounts they'd set up. My anger seethed, boiling hotter than ever. They were planning a future together with money she'd stolen from me, funds I'd worked hard to save. And worst of all, she'd set up an alias, making it impossible for anyone to trace the transactions back to her if she disappeared. In that moment, I realized that my plan for revenge had to be as devastating as her betrayal. I couldn't just catch her in the act. I needed to tear down everything she'd built in the shadows. I reached out to Garrett again, asking him to follow a money trail this time. Together, we crafted a plan that would not only expose her but completely drain the offshore account before she had a chance to use it. The final piece of the puzzle was almost in place. Soon, Jessica would have no idea what had hit her, no clue how her world was crumbling around her. And as I plotted each detail, I felt a grim satisfaction settle over me. She'd shattered the life we'd built together, piece by piece. But she had no idea that I'd been watching her every move, dismantling her betrayal right under her nose. I knew I was nearing the endgame, but I couldn't rush it. Jessica had to believe she was still in control, still the one playing the game. Little did she know, the tables had turned completely. The night before I set my plan in motion, I lay beside Jessica, the silence between us louder than any words. She was sound asleep, her breathing deep and steady, unaware that this was the last night she'd ever feel any comfort in our bed. I stayed awake, staring at the ceiling, a twisted sense of calm settling over me. Tomorrow, I would dismantle her lies, severing every tie she thought she'd so cleverly hidden. Early the next morning, I drove downtown to meet Garrett at a quiet cafe. He handed me a folder filled with the final pieces of information: bank statements, offshore transfers, records of the assets she and Daniel had siphoned from our accounts. I could practically feel the weight of betrayal in my hands. Garrett gave me a solemn nod as he slid a small flash drive across the table. "This is everything. Every transfer, every account. he said. You sure about this? I nodded, more sure than I've ever been. Back in my car, I inserted the flash drive into my laptop, scrolling through the records. Everything was in place. Jessica and Daniel had created a maze of shell accounts, thinking it would hide the money trail. But Garrett's meticulous work had cracked it wide open, exposing every single dollar she'd taken from me. I spent the rest of the day setting up a web of my own. I transferred nearly every last dollar out of the offshore accounts they'd established, rerouting it into a separate account under a different alias. They'd wake up the next morning with a balance of zero and no way to trace the money back. As an added layer, I sent anonymous tips to the IRS about suspicious activities involving Daniel Barrett's finances, knowing that the federal investigation would be thorough and ruthless. Jessica wouldn't just lose her escape funds. She'd lose the very man she'd staked her future on. The next phase was even more personal. I went home that evening, maintaining the mask of normalcy as best as I could. Jessica was busy texting. Her face lit up with a faint smile, too absorbed in her phone to notice the chill that had settled in the room. She didn't even glance up when I walked past her to the bedroom. In our closet, I retrieved a slim, innocuous black box I'd hidden weeks ago. Inside was a tiny USB drive with recordings from every hidden camera in the house. I'd kept them as evidence, but tonight, they would serve a different purpose. I loaded the files onto a private server, then drafted a series of emails that would bring her double life crashing down. The next morning, Jessica left for work as usual, giving me the perfect window of opportunity. I logged onto her work email, an access code Garrett had helped me crack weeks ago. Then I set the trap, scheduling the emails to send to her entire team, the HR department, and even the corporate office. Attached were the videos from our home, showing every encounter, every secret phone call, every stolen moment she'd spent planning her future with Daniel. In the subject line, I wrote, "Urgent," for immediate review. By lunchtime, I received the first panic text from Jessica. "Jessica, what did you do? Why are you doing this?" I waited, letting her words linger in the void, before finally responding. "Me, only what you already did to us." By evening, she was at the door, banging furiously, pleading to be let in. Her keys were useless. I'd had the locks changed earlier that afternoon, anticipating her return. I watched her from the upstairs window, savoring the satisfaction of seeing her desperation, the panic that contorted her face. I'd never seen her like this, disheveled, helpless. The confidence, the casual indifference she'd worn so well over the past few months, had been stripped away. Finally, I opened the door. She staggered in, red-faced, her eyes wild with a mixture of anger and fear. "What did you do to me?" she hissed, voice trembling. I crossed my arms, blocking her from moving further into the house. "I just gave you what you were planning to give me," I said coldly. "You stole our money, you planned a life without me, and you thought I'd never notice. But you underestimated me, Jessica. You thought I'd let you walk all over me, that I'd be too trusting, too naive to see what was right in front of me." She shook her head, eyes darting as if searching for an escape. "Please, I can explain. I was confused, okay? I didn't mean for it to go this far." "Oh, so it was a mistake?" I said, my voice dripping with sarcasm. "I saw everything, Jessica. The money, the plans, the hotel stays. You and Daniel. Did you really think you'd get away with it?" Her face paled at the mention of Daniel's name. I saw her realization dawn as she grasped the depth of my knowledge. "Wait," she stammered, her voice almost a whisper. "What did you do to him?" I felt a smile tug at the corners of my mouth. Daniel is going to be dealing with federal investigators soon. They're going to dig into every financial corner of his life, every shady account, every dollar he helped you steal from me. By the time they're done, he'll be lucky if he sees the outside of a jail cell again. The color drained from her face. "No, you can't. I didn't want this." "But you did want it, Jessica. You wanted a future with him, didn't you?" I let the words hang in the air, each one a nail in the coffin of her betrayal. She sank onto the floor, her hands covering her face as a broken sob escaped her lips. "Please," she whispered. "I didn't mean for this to happen. I love you, I I stopped her with a raised hand. Don't you dare say you love me. You love the life we built together, the security I gave you, but you never loved me. If you did, you wouldn't have done this. She shook her head, her eyes pleading, but I felt nothing, just an emptiness where love had once lived. Pack a bag and get out, I said, my voice firm, unyielding. I want you gone by morning. If you try to contact me or the kids, I'll make sure you lose more than just your job. She didn't argue. She was defeated, stripped of her illusions, every last piece of her broken. The next few days were surreal. I'd reclaimed my life, but it felt strange, hollow, almost. Jessica was gone, and my house was quiet. Yet the victory I'd imagined felt less satisfying than I'd expected. A week later, I received a call from Garrett. He'd been following up on the IRS tip and found out that Daniel had been questioned and was now under investigation. The firm had cut ties with him immediately, and rumors swirled about federal charges and possible jail time. Jessica, too, had been dismissed from her job, her reputation now in tatters after the videos had circulated among her colleagues. They got what they deserved, Garrett said, his voice filled with grim satisfaction. Justice, one way or another. I thanked him, but as I hung up, I found myself staring at the family photos on the wall, the memories of what once was. Jessica had ripped us apart, and no amount of revenge could rebuild the years we'd lost. 2 weeks later, I walked into my children's room, watching as they slept, their breaths soft and even, innocent in a world full of betrayal and loss. I had done all this to protect them, to ensure they'd never feel the consequences of their mother's choices. But as I closed the door, I felt a bittersweet pang. My revenge had been perfect, ruthless. I'd taken back everything Jessica had stolen from me, destroyed her plans, and exposed her lies. Yet it came at a price, a cold, heavy price that sat in my chest, reminding me that revenge, however justified, left scars no one could see. In the end, she'd lost everything she betrayed me for. But in reclaiming my life, I realized that something irreplaceable had been shattered, too. The man I once was, the man who believed in trust, in love, and forever. And that was the final revenge. And that's how it ended. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe, like, and comment your thoughts below.